Hello, and thank you for joining us again. Today we are going to be reading the Russian folktale of Sadko, the Dulcimer Player. In Novgorod, in the old days, there was a young man, just a boy he was, the son of a rich merchant who had lost all his money and passed away. So Sadko was very poor. He had not a kopeck in the world except what the people gave him when he played his dulcimer for their dancing. He had blue eyes and curling hair, and he was strong, and would have been merry. But it is dull work playing for other folk to dance, and Sadko dared not dance with any other girl, for he had no money to marry on, and he did not want to be chased away as a beggar. The young women of Novgorod, they never looked at the handsome Sadko. No, they smiled with their bright eyes at the young men who danced with them, and if they ever spoke to Sadko, it was just to tell him sharply to keep the music going or to play faster. So Sadko lived alone with his dulcimer, and made do with half a loaf when he could not get a whole, and with some crumbs when he could not get a crust. And he did not mind so very much what came to him, so long as he could play his dulcimer and walk along the banks of the little river Volkhov that flows by Novgorod, or on the shores of the lake, making music for himself and seeing the pale mists rise over the water, and dawn or sunset across the shining river. There is no other girl in Novgorod so pretty as my little river, he used to say. Night after night he would sit by the banks of the river or on the shores of the lake, playing the dulcimer and singing to himself. Sometimes he helped the fishermen on the lake, and they would give him a little fish for his supper in payment for his young, strong arms. And it happened that one evening the fishermen asked him to watch their nets for them on the shore, while they went off to take their fish and sell them in the square at Novgorod. Sadko sat there on the shore on a rock and played his dulcimer and sang. Very sweetly he sang of the fair lake and the lovely river, the little river that he thought prettier than all the girls of Novgorod. And while he was singing, he saw a whirlpool in the lake, little waves flying from it across the water, and in the middle a hollow down into the water itself. And in the hollow he saw the head of a great man with blue hair and a golden crown. He knew that the huge man was the Tzar of the sea. And the man came nearer, walking up out of the depths of the lake, a huge, great, giant man with blue hair falling over to his waist and across his broad shoulders. Little waves ran from him in all directions as he came striding up out of the water. Sadko did not know whether to run or stay, but the Tsar of the Sea called out to him in a great voice like wind and water in a storm. Sadko of Novgorod, you have played and sung many days by the side of this lake and on the banks of the little river Volkhov. My daughters love your music, and it has pleased me too. Throw out a net into the water and draw it in, and the waters will pay you for your singing. And if you are satisfied with the payment, you must come and play to us down in the green palace of the sea. With that, the Tsar of the Sea went down again into the waters of the lake. The waves closed over him with a roar, and presently the lake was as smooth and calm as it had ever been. Sadko thought and said to himself, well, there is no harm done in casting out a net. So he threw the net out into the lake. He sat down again and played on his dulcimer and sang, and when he had finished his song, the dusk had fallen down and the moon shone over the lake. He put down his dulcimer and took hold of the ropes of the net and began to draw it up out of the silver water. Easily the ropes came, and the net dripping and glittering in the moonlight. I was dreaming, said Sadko. I was asleep when I saw the Tsar of the Sea, and there is nothing in the net at all. And then, just as the last of the net was coming ashore, he saw something in it, dark and square. He dragged it out and found it was a coffer. He opened the coffer, and it was full of precious stones, green, red, gold, gleaming in the light of the moon. Diamonds showed sparkling in its depths. There can be no harm in taking these stones, said Sadko, whether I dreamed it or not. He took the coffer on his shoulder and bent under the weight of it, strong though he was. He put it in a safe place. All night he sat and watched by the nets and played and sang and planned what he would do. In the morning the fishermen came, laughing and merry after their night in Novgorod, and they gave him a little fish for watching their nets, and he made a fire on the shore and cooked it and ate it as he used to do. "And that is my last meal as a poor man," says Sadko. "Ah me, who knows if I shall be happier." Then he set the coffer on his shoulder and tramped away for Novgorod. "Who is that?" they asked at the gates. "Only Sadko the Dulcimer Player," one replied. "Turn porter," said another. "One trade is as good as another," said Sadko, and he walked into the city. Remembering what his father had taught him, he sold a few of the stones, 2 at a time, and with that he got for them he set up a booth in the market. Small things led to great, and he was soon one of the richest traders in all of Novgorod. Now, there was not a girl in the town who could look too sweetly at Sadko. "He has golden hair," says one. "Blue eyes like the sea," says another. "He could lift the world on his strong shoulders," said a third. A little money, you see, opens everyone's eyes. But Sadko was not changed by his good fortune. Still he walked and played by the little river Volkhov. When work was done and the traders gone, Sadko would take his dulcimer and play and sing on the banks of the river. And still he said, "There is no girl in all Novgorod as pretty as my little river." Every time he came back from his long voyages, for he was trading far and near, like the greatest of merchants, he went at once to the banks of the river to see how his sweetheart fared. And he always brought her some little present and threw it into the waves. For 12 years he lived unmarried in Novgorod, and every year made voyages, buying and selling, and always growing richer and richer. Many were the mothers in Novgorod who would have liked to see him married to their daughters. Many were the pillows wet with tears of the young girls that thought of the blue eyes of Sadko and his golden hair. And then in the 12th year, since he had walked into Novgorod with the coffer on his shoulder, he was sailing in a ship on the Caspian Sea, far, far away. For many days the ship sailed on, and Sadko sat on the deck and played his dulcimer and sang of Novgorod and of the little river Volkhov that flows under the walls of the town. Blue was the Caspian Sea, and the waves were like furrows in a field, long lines of white under the steady wind, while the sails swelled and the ship shot over the water. And then one day, the ship stopped suddenly. In the middle of the sea, far from land, the ship stopped and trembled in the waves as if she were held by a big hand. "We are aground," cried the sailors, and the captain, the great one, told them to take their soundings. 70 fathoms by the bow it was, and 70 fathoms by the stern. "We are not aground," says the captain, "unless there is a rock sticking up like a needle in the middle of the Caspian Sea." "There is magic in this," said one of the sailors. "Hoist more sail," says the captain, and up go the white sails, sailing out into the wind, while the masts began to bend and creak, and still the ship lay shivering and did not move out there in the middle of the water. "Hoist more sail yet," says the captain, and up go the rest of the sails, swelling and tugging, while the masts creak and groan with the wind, but still the ship lay there shivering and did not move. "There is an unlucky one aboard," said an old sailor. "We must draw lots and find him and throw him overboard into the sea." The other sailors agreed to this, and still Sadko sat and played his dulcimer and sang. The sailors cut pieces of string, all of a length, as many as there were souls in the ship, and one of those strings they cut in half. Then they made them into a bundle, and each man plucked one string. And Sadko stopped his playing for a moment to pluck a string, and his was the string that had been cut in half. "Magician! Sorcerer! Unclean one!" shouted the sailors. "Not so," said Sadko. "I remember now, an old promise I made, and I keep it willingly." He took his dulcimer in his hand and leapt from the ship into the blue Caspian Sea. The waves had scarcely closed over his head before the ship shot forward again, and flew over the waves like a swan's feather, and came in the end of the safely to her harbor. Sadko dropped into the waves, down, 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 as they closed over him. He sank further and further like a pebble thrown into a pool. First the water was blue, then green, and then strange fish with goggly eyes and golden fins swam around him as he sank. He came at last to the bottom of the sea, and there on the bottom of the sea was a palace built of green wood. Yes, all the timbers of all the ships that have been wrecked in all the seas of the world are in that palace, and they are all green and cunningly fit together. so that the palace is worth a 10 days' journey just to see it. And in front of the palace, Sadko saw two big cobbly sturgeons, each 150 feet long, lashing their tails and guarding the gates. Now sturgeons are the oldest of all fish, and these are the oldest of all sturgeons. Sadko walked between the sturgeons and through the gates of the palace. Inside there was a great hall, and the Tzar of the Sea lay resting in the hall, with his gold crown on his head, and his blue hair floating around him in the water, and his great body covered in scales lying along the hall. The Tzar of the Sea filled the hall, and there was room in that hall for a village. And there were fish swimming this way and that, in and out of the windows. "Ah, Sadko," says the Tzar of the Sea, "you took what the sea gave you, but you have been a long time in coming to sing in the palaces of the sea. 12 years I have lain here waiting for you." "Great Tsar, please forgive," said Sadko. "Sing now," says the Tzar of the Sea, and his voice was like the beating of waves. And Sadko played on his dulcimer and sang. He sang of Novgorod and of the little river Volkhov, which he loved. It was in his song that none of the girls of Novgorod were as pretty as the little river. And there was the sound of wind over the lake in his song, the sound of ripples under the prow of a boat, the sound of waves upon the shore, the sound of a river flowing past tall reeds, and the sound of the river trickling at night. And all the time he played cunningly on the dulcimer. The girls of Novgorod had never danced to so sweet a tune when in the old days Sadko played his dulcimer to earn kopecks and crusts of bread. Never had the Tsar of the Sea heard such music. "I would dance," said the Tsar of the Sea, and he stood up like a tall tree in the hall. "Play on," said the Tsar of the Sea, and he strode through the gates. The sturges guarding the gates stirred the water with their tails. And if the Tzar of the Sea was huge in the hall, he was huger still when he stood outside in the bottom of the sea. He grew taller and taller, towering like a mountain. His feet were like small hills. His blue hair hung down to his waist, and he was covered in green scales. And he began to dance on the bottom of the sea. The dancing was great. The sea boiled and ships went down. Waves rolled as big as houses. The sea overflowed its shores, and whole towns were covered in water as the Tsar danced mightily on the bottom of the sea. Hither and thither rushed waves, and the very earth shook at the dancing of the tremendous Tsar. He danced till he was tired. Then he came back to the palace of green wood, and passed the sturgeons, and shrank into himself, and came through the great gates into the hall, where Sadko still played on his dulcimer and sang. "You have played well and given me pleasure," says the Tsar of the Sea. "I have 30 daughters, and you shall choose one and marry her, and be a prince of the sea." "Better than all the maidens, I love my little river," says Sadko. And the Tsar of the Sea laughed and threw his head back, with his blue hair floating all over the hall. And then there came in the 30 daughters of the Tsar of the Sea. Beautiful they were, lovely and graceful, but 29 of them passed by. Sadko fidgeted with his dulcimer and thought of his little river. Then came the 30th, and Sadko cried aloud, "Here is the only maiden in the world as pretty as my little river," he said. And she looked at him with eyes that shone like stars reflected in the river. Her hair was dark, like the river at night. She laughed, and her voice was like the flowing of a river. "And what is the name of your little river?" says the Tsar. "It is the little river Volkhov that flows by Novgorod," said Sadko. "But your daughter is as fair as the little river, and I would gladly marry her if she will have me." "It is a strange thing," says the Tsar, "but Volkhov is the name of my youngest daughter." He put Sadko's hand in the hand of his youngest daughter, and they kissed each other. And as they kissed, Sadko saw a necklace round her neck, and knew it for one he had thrown into the river as a present for his sweetheart. She smiled and said, "Come," and took him away to a palace of her own, and showed him a coffer, and in that coffer were bracelets and rings and earrings, all the gifts he had thrown into the river over the years. Sadko laughed for joy and kissed the youngest daughter of the sea, and she kissed him back. "Oh, my little river," he said, "there is no girl in all the world as pretty as you." Well, they were married, And the Tsar of the Sea laughed at the wedding feast till the palace shook and the fish swam off in all directions. And after the feast, Sadko went off with his bride, and they went together to her palace. And before they slept, she kissed him tenderly and said, "O Sadko, you will not forget me? You will play to me sometimes and sing?" "I shall never lose sight of you, my pretty one," says he, "and as for music, I will sing and play all the day long." "That's as may be," she said, and they fell asleep. And in the middle of the night, Sadko happened to turn in bed, and he touched the princess with his left foot, but she was cold, 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 as ice in January. And with that touch of cold he awoke, and he was lying under the walls of Novgorod, with his dulcimer in his hand, and one of his feet was in the little river Volkhov, and the moon was shining. After that, some say that he went into town and lived on alone until he died. Others say that he took his dulcimer and swam out into the middle of the river and sank under the water, looking for his little princess. They say he found her, and lives still in the green palaces at the bottom of the sea, and when there is a big storm, you know that Sadko is playing on his dulcimer and singing, and that the Tsar of the Sea is dancing his tremendous dance down there on the bottom, under the waves.